Hello and welcome back to Bookish. I took a week off from doing tags last Tuesday, and in the meantime I accumulated 4 tags. Lots of wonderful people were kind enough to tag me to do various tags, so I thought I would try to catch up on all of them today by doing 4 tags a day and making this kind of a roll your own tag Tuesday. You can choose any one of the 4, or none of the 4 actually, or all 4, or I don't know, however many. I'll leave timestamps below in the show notes so you can skip to the ones that you want to do or want to see the most. And that's what we'll do. So I'll have a little intro card for each one, and then I'll go on and talk about the tags. So the first tag I want to do is Around the World in 8T Prompts. Clever name. And this tag was created by Marc over at Book Time with Elvis. And I was tagged by Marc, but also then tagged by Marc Nash to do this tag. And there are 8 prompts. And at the end, I'm just going to tag one person. Since I'm doing so many tag videos today, I'm just going to tag one person for each. Sorry about that. But always, if you think the tag looks interesting and you want to do it, please feel free. So prompt number 1. Theater. Do you read plays? If so, tell us about a favorite. I do read plays occasionally. I don't view reading plays as different than reading anything else, really. If I want to read it, I will. I think one of the plays I remember reading first that had an impact on me was The Seagull by Anton Chekhov. I've never seen the play performed, never seen a movie adaptation, but it's got all kinds of really kind of, I don't know, confusing, unhappy, love, suicide attempts, people being discarded, and anyway, it's just really involved and fairly Russian, and the death of a seagull is symbolic in anyway. I just really liked it, and I enjoyed reading it, and I think I went on and read Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard after that. So that would be the play that I would use for this prompt. Prompt number 2, travel. Sadly, we can't travel these days, but do you have a favorite travel writer or a travel book that you take away on an armchair adventures? So when I did travel, and I never have traveled all that much, but when I did travel, I usually took a book related to the place I was going. When my wife and I went to Ireland, I took a book of William Trevor stories and so on. And you know, that's just kind of one of the things I do. But I do have read a few travel books, and my favorite is, by the way, the most popular answer to this question. My favorite travel writer is Ryszard Kapuscinski. I think I'm going to mention a different book than most other people mentioned. The book of his that I liked the most, or I liked, was The Shadow of the Sun. It's basically a travel memoir of his time spent in Africa, in various places in Africa, and I've mentioned this many times on my channel, but for a brief period of time I was kind of really interested in reading about events and politics and crises taking place in Africa, and I believe it was this book that kind of inspired my interest in Africa, even though it's not necessarily about those things. But that's where that came from, so that would be my answer to the travel prompt. Prompt number 3 is time. What book took you the longest time to read, and why was that? Well, the book that took me the longest time to read is a book that I am still reading now, and that is the complete short stories of Ernest Hemingway, the Finca Vigia edition. I've had this book probably since college, which for me is now something like 32 years ago, and I still haven't finished it, and that is on purpose. As you may know, Hemingway was a really important writer. That's probably true for lots of young men in America who became interested in literature. And I happen to believe that short stories are oftentimes his best work. And I've saved the last 5 short stories in this book to read so that I never ran out of Hemingway. And then I remembered I haven't read The Torrents of Spring or Hemingway's poetry. But anyway, that's why I saved stories so I would have some Hemingway to read later, and I still have, I don't know, 4 or 5 stories there to read. So that's why that would be the book that's taken me the longest to read, and the book it's taken me the longest to read. By the way, short story books are like that. The complete short stories of William Trevor will sooner or later replace the Hemingway short story book. Prompt number 4, traditional is traditional. Fairy tales or nursery rhymes that are some of your favorites, and what are some you would not think suitable for kids today? I don't think most nursery rhymes are things we think about as nursery rhymes are suitable for children. who is it? Jack Sprat, who could eat no fat and his wife could eat no lean, so he puts in her a pumpkin. And essentially just imprisons her in a pumpkin. That's pretty inappropriate. I think my favorite fairy tale may or may not be a fairy tale. It's more like a folk tale, and that's the story of Robert the Bruce and the Spider. After one of his many failed attempts to win independence for Scotland and make himself king, Robert the Bruce, the story goes, was hiding out in a cave, and he watched a spider attempt to span a distance to go from one side of the cave to the other, and it tried 7 times, and on the 8th time it succeeded, and according to the fairy tale, folk tale, that inspired Robert the Bruce to try an 8th time, and he succeeded in winning Scottish independence at the Battle of Bannockburn after that, and that's my favorite kind of folk tale story, and I think that's pretty appropriate for kids. Let's see, prompt 5, tasty food, glorious food. What are some of your favorite books about food? I really tried to think of this, and I don't have a lot of books that are about food. So, I just recently read, and I didn't get the copy off my shelf. I just recently read George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, and I mentioned to you that I really liked the parts about the restaurant, because it reminded me of the time I spent working in the restaurant. If you've read that book, the restaurant is not described in glowing or attractive terms, so it may seem odd because of the grossness of it, but it did remind me of restaurant work, and I do have some stories and pretty good nostalgic memories of working in restaurants. So that's what I went with for my tasty prompt, my food book. Prompt 6 is terrible. Who is a truly terrible, nasty, but memorable character that stands out for you? I went with an unusual choice for me, and that is Brady Hartsfield, the main character from Stephen King's mystery novel, Mr. Mercedes. He is, in fact, a killer, a murderer, who is, for the most part, unremorseful. And there's some disturbing information about he and his mother and the death of his mother. Anyway, so I went with Brady Hartsfield. Prompt number 7 is truth. The T is truth. The truth is often stranger than fiction, they say. Give us some examples of this from your extensive reading. Okay, so I just went here strictly presidential. So my favorite presidential weird fact has to do with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. John Adams was the 2nd president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson III, both played an important role during the American Revolution in securing support from France. They were close friends for a while, and then during the presidential campaign of 1796, they became enemies because of some terrible things that Jefferson said about Adams, and vice versa. And then Jefferson went on to defeat Adams in the 1800 election, and they became estranged. They were no longer friends. But after both men, who had played an important role in the American Revolution, Jefferson, the main draftsman of the Declaration of Independence, Adams worked with him on that as well. After they'd both been president, as we find oftentimes with presidents of the United States, they began writing one another letters, and they became friendly again through this process of writing letters. And then both men died on the exact same day. Both men died on July the 4th, 1826. Which was the 50-year anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Adams' last words were, "Jefferson survives." This is, mythically speaking, his last words were, "Jefferson survives." I find it kind of hard to believe, when in reality Jefferson had preceded him in death by a few hours. So that's kind of one of those weird stories that 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 2 men who had worked on the document together and had both been presidents, get back to being friends, and then they both die on July the 4th, Independence Day, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That's weird. Also, presidential history-wise, Zachary Taylor died while he was in office. He died somewhat mysteriously after a July the 4th celebration. And there was some belief that perhaps he had been poisoned. He was president during a very contentious time. There was some belief that maybe he had been poisoned, and about 25 or 30 years ago, they actually got permission to dig him up, to dig up his grave, and to test his hair to see if there were traces of poison in it. There were not, and then they just reburied him. Zachary Taylor probably, or one of the new theories is that Zachary Taylor was the victim of unclean water. that the White House sat kind of at the edge of Washington, D.C.'s leach field, where all the sewage more or less ended up, and that it had made its way into the groundwater there. So that's weird. And then also just from a specific book, the story of the assassination of President Garfield, contained in this book by Candace Millard called Destiny of the Republic. It is pretty weird. Garfield's assassin believed that because he was mentally unbalanced, he believed that by killing Garfield he would become a big hero. He was so convinced that he would be a hero that he picked out the gun to kill President Garfield with that he thought would look the best in a museum, and he decided to use his trial to kind of plead his case after he shot President Garfield. But he really didn't kill President Garfield. He shot him twice, once in the elbow and once in the back. But this was a time period in which doctors had not all kind of bought into the germ theory of infection. And so the first doctor who treated him just stuck his dirty fingers in the bullet hole and then treated him. And what actually killed President Garfield were infectious abscesses that built up in his body. And essentially, in one way, his doctors actually tortured him to death. But anyway, Leon J. Golds was actually convicted of killing President Garfield. And those are pretty strange stories, all involving presidents. Let's see. Prompt number 7 is... Oh, wait, that was truth. I missed one. Oh, yeah. Prompt number 8 is to make up your own tea-related prompt. So I'm going to go with the one that Marc Nash made up because he tagged me after having done this. And his tea was triptych. You could pick a novel that's told in 3 parts. You could, somehow group things together in 3s. And so I started looking around my bookshelves for things that were in 3 that were somewhat related. And this is, I went way overboard with this, but oh well. So what I came up with 3 were books related to Vietnam. So that led me naturally to Tim O'Brien. Tim O'Brien, masterpiece novel, The Thing They Carried, actually about probably somewhat autobiographical about his experience as a soldier in Vietnam. Then Going After Cacciato, another story, even though it's somewhat magical realist. I hate to use that term because it turns people off. It's not that, but there's definitely some non-reality going on in this book. And then even his great book, In the Lake of the Woods, involves a mystery surrounding a Vietnam veteran. So I thought that, and once I thought that, I realized, wow, I have a lot of books related to Vietnam. Maybe that's not that surprising for an American. So I found 3 Vietnam books, nonfiction books, just the first being Stanley Carnell's Vietnam: A History, which is a good kind of 1-volume history of Vietnam, I thought. And then Vietnam Shadows by Arnold R. Isaacs, The War, Its Ghost and Its Legacy, obviously about the aftermath of Vietnam and its impact on American society and foreign policy. And then The Debate Over Vietnam by David W. Levy, about, examining the historical reasons why we got into the war in Vietnam and what the war in Vietnam means. And then I thought, wow, I have novels that are kind of, related to Vietnam, not directly. So, In Country by Bobby Ann Mason, a story about the impact of the Vietnam War on a young woman whose father died and her relationship with her uncle, who's a Vietnam veteran. Graham Greene's The Quiet American, which is set in Vietnam and really is more about American involvement in destabilizing governments in Vietnam. And then a love triangle in which an English journalist competes with an American man who he finds out to be a CIA agent. And then Robert Stone's somewhat kind of considered classic, The Dog Soldiers, which is about a man who is in Vietnam near the end of the Vietnam War, who then gets involved in drug trafficking, the drug trade, and the novel's really about that. So there you go. That was my overboard triptych response. And then I'm going to make up a tag that starts with T, because the idea for prompt 8 is you make up a prompt that starts with T. And so my T is going to be tactile. And what I thought here was to talk about a book that you love holding, that physically is enjoyable to hold, that it's pleasurable on a tactile level. And so I went with this copy of A Life by Italo Svevo. I really didn't like the book very much, and I've held this book up before, but I love this little weird square book with this paper cover, and I think those are French flaps. it's just it's a paperback, so it's kind of flexible and soft, but it is a book that is just, truly a tactile pleasure, and I probably have, ruined the cover by talking about it, by holding it so much. It's got this weird picture which almost feels like a sticker on the front. So there you go. That's my T for tactile. I'm going to tag Sonia from An Enthusiastic Reader to do this tag, hopefully in an effort to encourage Sonia to make more videos. I know you're busy, but I love your videos, so I'm going to tag you, Sonia, to do this tag. And there you go. There is the Around the World in 8T Prompts tag. Okay, so my second tag on Roll Your Own Tag Tuesday is the Life Stories tag created by Marc from Book Time with Elvis, who also created the Around the World in 8T Prompts, which was the first tag in this video, and I was tagged by Roz from Scally Dandling About the Books. So this is a book. This is a tag pretty much all about biographies and autobiographies. So prompt number 1. Do you have a preference for biography or autobiography? My preference is for biography. I like that scholarly aspect to biography. And while, biography is as much about the choices the biographer makes as anything else, and therefore it is really a story or a picture of the person that the biographer wants to create, I still prefer that to autobiography. Something about it just feels a little bit more rigorous. Prompt number 2, do you gravitate towards a specific area of biography like sports, celebrity, history, etc.? I would say that most of the biographies I'm interested in are biographies of writers or of creative people or of people who had political power at some time, as I think some of the titles in my list will show. Prompt number 3, have you ever read the life story of someone and in doing so changed your opinion of them for better or for worse? And then an example. Okay, so strangely, I've read 2 biographies of Sinclair Lewis, and they're not short. The first biography of Sinclair Lewis, you're probably going to be able to read anything, is Sinclair Lewis, An American Life by Mark Schorer. This book was published, I think, sometime in the 70s, and I believe it was a really widely regarded book. That book gave me the image of the American author, Sinclair Lewis, as being somewhat pathetic, somewhat ridiculous, and then later I read a biography of Sinclair Lewis called Sinclair Lewis, Rebel from Main Street by Richard Lingemann, which I think Richard Lingemann set out to rehabilitate Sinclair Lewis's reputation as a person and as a writer, and I think he succeeded. So this book changed my opinion, the opinion I had of Sinclair Lewis that was created in the other book. So that's my example, or my answer for prompt number 2. Prompt number 3, no, sorry, that was my example for prompt number 3. Prompt number 4 is, must you always know who the person is before picking up their life story? The answer is no. I knew who Patti Smith was, but I read her memoir of her time in New York with Robert Mapplethorpe without really knowing a lot of details about Patti Smith, and so I think that would count. I don't have to know. Oftentimes the biography is a good way to know, but I will say most of the biographies that I have read are biographies of people who are famous and I probably knew something about. Let's see, prompt number 5. Have you ever met someone whose biography or autobiography you have read? And the answer is no, I have not. Prompt number 6. What do you think about books that are described as semi-autobiographical? So I assume this is like that kind of autofiction, autobiographical fiction, and I don't have a problem with it. It doesn't matter to me. I have an example here that I'm going to recommend later, which I thought was just a great book, but I can also see how those kinds of books and that kind of writing could allow the author to get away with things to avoid criticism by just saying, well, of course, it's my life. That's what really happened. Prompt number 7, give an example of a life story that really surprised you. I'm going to go with Queen Victoria's life story, which I kind of read in Lucy Worsley's biography, Queen Victoria, 24 Days That Changed Her Life. This looks at 24 specific day events of Queen Victoria's life and how that affected her. I really enjoyed this, and I was surprised that Queen Victoria was little bit more saucy than I thought she was, and that she and her husband enjoyed their relationship. And so that really, I knew she was devoted to Prince Albert, but anyway. I was also surprised at how independent-minded she was and how much of the work, that she kind of took on herself. Anyway, I found that surprising. Prompt number 8, what biographies, autobiographies, memoirs, etc. are currently on your TBR? Can't think of one that I have on my TBR, but I am currently reading In My Own Moccasins by First Nations author Helen Knott, which is a memoir of her experience with sexual violence and drug addiction and recovery. And I'm not quite finished with it, but I believe also in how First Nations spiritualism kind of helped to rescue her from a lot of the problems that she was having. It's quite powerful and remarkable so far. Let's see. Prompt number 9. Whose life story did you find particularly hard going, either emotionally difficult to read or just very boring? I'm going to go with H.L. Mencken, the writer, critic, curmudgeon. H.L. Mencken. I read Mencken, A Life by Fred Hobson at one point, and it is a really long biography, more than 500 pages, and I will be honest with you, it was a bit of a chore to get through, and I'm not sure that I retained a lot of information about H.L. Mencken from that biography, so not my best use of time. Prompt 10, is there anyone you know personally who you feel should have their life story written down? Yes, well, personally, I've known her personally through BookTube, Alba from Seriella, because she is a badass rock star who's led an amazing, rich life of compassion and activism, and just an incredibly impressive person. She should write a memoir, or someone should write a biography of her because of that. Prompt 11, have you read any diaries or collections of letters? If so, by the way, that's Alba. Her channel name is Seriella. You should go subscribe. So back to 11. Have you read any diaries or collection of letters? If so, which ones do you find interesting? I read, for research purposes, I read a lot of the letters of F. Scott Fitzgerald. And so I'm going to say F. Scott Fitzgerald, A Life in Letters. There's also F. Scott Fitzgerald's letters in Dear Scott, Dear Max, letters between he and his editor Maxwell Perkins. There's also, what is it I've held up before? Dear Scott, Dear Zelda, the letters between Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda Fitzgerald, which, by the way, is just great. I just love that collection of letters a lot, but I hold that one up all the time. And then, let's see, prompt 12 is, yes, prompt 12, what are a few life story books you would recommend for us to read? So, Olivia Lang is probably most famous now for Lonely City. I think that's the best receiver book, but I really like this book, A Trip to Echo Springs, because it contains kind of mini biographies of lots of writers, and I like things like that, but also kind of her story, and she's essentially exploring the connection between alcoholism, and creative writing. I thought that was good. Last year for the BookTube Prize, I read Solitary by Albert Woodfox, in which he basically describes the story of his transformation in the 40 years he spent in solitary confinement. Incredibly powerful memoir about the injustice of our justice system. And then probably most mysteriously and memorably and beautifully, Dear Friend from My Life, I Write to You and Yours by Yi-Yoon Lee, in which she kind of explores her own struggles with mental health issues, and how reading and books and a writer named William Trevor, one of my favorites, kind of helped her out of that situation. So there you go. There is my life stories tag. Thank you to Mark from Book Time with Elvis for making it. Thank you, Ross, for tagging me. I'm going to tag Pete from Pete's Pensieve. I believe that's it, or it's Pete's Pensive. But Pete's Pensieve. I'm going to tag you, a relatively new booktuber, incredibly thoughtful, and man, listening to him to recite poetry is a delight. You should go over and check out his channel. I don't know if Pete watches my channel or not, but if you do, Pete, please do this tag. There you go. There's the second tag for Roll Your Own Tag Tuesday. On to the third. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to Tag 3 on Roll Your Own Tag Tuesday. This tag is the My Reading Life in 10 Books tag. It's an original tag suggested by a commenter named Victoria M. to Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading. Kelly tagged me, so I wanted to do the tag. Some of these answers are going to be, some of these books I'm going to mention are going to be books I've mentioned before. Hopefully maybe I can find a little bit kind of newer, better insight into maybe the books. Anyway, so the idea is you're supposed to pick 10 books that made you into the reader that you are. So my first book would be The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. This book was given to me by my mom when I was about 12 years old. I was along with the Lord of the Rings set. It came in a really cool gold box with all kinds of weird symbols on it. And I usually talk about the Lord of the Rings as being that formative book. I actually did read The Hobbit first. And, you know, this really got me into fantasy reading. And I mentioned to you I've read the Tolkien books over and over again several times. But also in the back of this book there's a little weird cultural artifact where I wrote a review of the book right there. In my 12th grade, my 12-year-old handwriting, it says, "This is a very good book, funny, lively, and never a dull moment." So I was also formed into a book reviewer, which, you know, ironically now I have a BookTube channel by The Hobbit. The second book I wanted to mention is The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. After I read a lot of fantasy series in junior high school and high school, introduced by the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, I kind of just reread those books throughout my high school years and didn't really read a lot of new books, sometimes added some fantasy books to what I was reading. In college, my best friend in college introduced me to the idea of reading Ernest Hemingway's works, and The Sun Also Rises was the first real Hemingway novel I read. And it really is, I've said this before, it really is the novel that got me interested in what we might refer to as literature. The third book of my 10 would be William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. It shouldn't surprise you to see this book on any list of books that I make. But one Christmas in college, I believe it was the Christmas of 1986, Christmas break from college in 1986, maybe 87, I just had a whole stack of books. I read As I Lay Dying, I read The Sound and the Fury, I read Absalom, Absalom. I read some fantasy books because I was still doing that at the time. But Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury is important to me because it is one of those books I go back to over and over again. And it convinced me that I could read hard books, for lack of a better way of putting it. The Sound and the Fury has a reputation of being really difficult to understand and a difficult book to read. And having read that, it gave me confidence to go on and read Absalom, Absalom, and Ulysses, and etc. Books that aren't really hard, but I would say are experimental in their format. So there's that. Let's see. The fourth book of my books would be Beloved by Toni Morrison. I put this book on a list of books that made me the reader I am, because this is the first book where that best friend of mine in college and I really disagreed. I tried to get him to read Beloved. He assured me that, you know, he didn't think there was anything in Beloved that wasn't in a book by William Faulkner, which is not true. And if you haven't heard me say this, I firmly believe that this is the greatest American novel written in the 20th century. You know, fight me. You know, I graduated from college, I got married, I started teaching, I went back to school to get a master's degree because I had some idea that I wanted to be a college professor and teach on the collegiate level. And one year I did an independent study project for credit as a part of my master's degree, in which I kind of evaluated the historical accuracy of World War I fiction written by American soldiers who'd fought in World War I. And one of the most important books in kind of giving me that idea and helping me develop that idea was The Great War and Modern Memory by Paul Fussell. This is the book which probably helped me understand that fiction is history, that fiction, in reality, all fiction is historical fiction, except for science fiction. All fiction is historical fiction in lots of ways. By the way, even science fiction is historical fiction in some ways because it's influenced by our idea. Anyway, so this kind of convinced me that fiction is history and also that history is fiction. Anyway, so there was that book, and then that book led me to the project which I wrote about Thomas Boyd for several years. And so that means that Thomas Boyd's novel Through the Wheat, which I forgot to get a copy of down. Let's see, which one of the copies do I want to get this time? I'll use this one because it's closest. So Thomas Boyd's World War I novel Through the Wheat then played a really important role in developing me as a reader and a writer. The next book I want to list, books that made me the reader I am, is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. I don't know that I've talked about Harry Potter on my channel before, but Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which I think is the third of the Harry Potter books. Yes. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban is the first of the Harry Potter books I read. And I read this after, essentially a long reluctance to read the first two Harry Potter books, which my wife, who was an elementary school teacher at the time, really loved and encouraged me to read. I finally read a book that she suggested, and I really liked the fun of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. And then that set me to read the other Harry Potter books. I've never read the first and second books, but the other, 5 Harry Potter books I read, and I enjoyed reading those because I read those along with my kids. My kids were old enough to read books, and we did the thing where we went to bookstores and waited till midnight till they started selling the new editions of Harry Potter. I think we started that with Order of the Phoenix and then followed that through the last 2 books as well, which was fun, and that shaped me in lots of ways as a reader. Also, I just want to mention a book that I read that my kids have liked, and a kind of a shared reading interest. My son really liked Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness when he was in high school, and that kind of caused me to go back and reread it and to see what he saw in it. And I still really don't like Heart of Darkness as much as he does, but it was kind of a shared reading moment with my son. My daughter and I share a taste for Sherlock Holmes stories and the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. So I've given her those books, and she's read those books, and she read those books, and we watched the Sherlock series on BBC, on the BBC produced Sherlock series starring Benedict Cumberbatch together, and have talked about those. And so that's kind of a formative shared reading experience. And then the 10th book on my list, I'm going to choose Père Goriot by Honoré de Balzac, because, as you know, I'm a huge fan of Balzac, and I couldn't not put a book of his on the list of books that made me the reader I am today, because part of the reader I am today is someone who enjoys reading Balzac. And this is the first Balzac novel I read, and I really, really liked it. And I think it's a pretty good entry point into the work of Balzac. So this tag, what is it again called? Yeah, My Reading Life in 10 Books is a really excellent tag. Got me to go over some books I talked about before, hopefully in a slightly different way. I'm going to tag Revenant Reads, a new channel to me, but I'd really like to hear about his reading history as well. So yeah, there we go. There's that tag. Okay, tag number 4, the Bar in the Bookcase tag, created by Jalen from the channel The Bar in the Bookcase, I believe. I was tagged by Zena from Beating Around the Books. Of course, links to those channels will be down below. This book tag basically involves taking an example of a cocktail or a drink and comparing that, or finding a work of fiction that goes with that. So prompt number 1 is an old-fashioned piece of historical fiction recommendation, and I'm going to go with an old favorite, and that is Regeneration by Pat Barker, part of the 3-part Regeneration series set in essentially what would be a psychiatric hospital dealing with soldiers who have what today we refer to as post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it involves a lot of the World War I poets, Siegfried Sassoon, etc. you might know about. I always enjoy historical fiction that involves real people, and this would be an example. Prompt number 2, Sidecar, a book with a strong supporting character. That would be the character of Pilar from For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. Pilar is the tough older woman who kind of brings Robert Jordan in and kind of mothers him and Maria, but she is also a hard-bitten resistance fighter in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. She's definitely a strong supporting character. Prompt number 3 is Manhattan, a book set in New York, and so I went with John Dos Passos, Manhattan Transfer. I'm going to be talking about John Dos Passos more in the coming months, but this is a standalone novel Dos Passos wrote. Dos Passos was an important early modernist writer, same generation as Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, etc. And this book attempts to kind of capture life in New York, life in Manhattan, from immigrants living in tenements to wealthy people. It is a fictional story, but it attempts to kind of show society in Manhattan at all levels. And Dos Passos is an overlooked writer who should not be overlooked. Prompt number 4, Bloody Mary, a book that scared you, messed you up. That would be 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. And the way it messes you up is by essentially numbing you to violence against women, by talking about and just essentially reciting these facts or fictional facts about murders of women that took place in Mexico, in which there are, I think, hundreds of killings described. And at some point you become numb to those things in the book, just like we become numb to the reality of that situation. And in that way, you just kind of, mind-blowingly messed me up in thinking about that. The next prompt number 5, is Espresso Martini, a book that kept you reading into the night. If I drank an espresso martini, no matter how much espresso in it is, I promise you the martini part would make me go to sleep at this point in my life. And so I picked a book I've talked about many times recently, and that's The Other Name by Jan Foss, because that's the honest answer. This book kept me reading late into the night because I enjoyed it so much. Prompt number 6, Sazerac, a book that left you disoriented. I'm going to go with another book I just finished, and that's Nupaming by Leanne Beta Samosaki. I said her name wrong. Simpson. This is just an incredibly powerful, interesting, funny, amusing, unapologetic book written from First Nations point of view, and I'm currently in the process of rereading it so I can enjoy it again and enjoy it more. Let's see. Prompt number 7 is, Long Island Prompt number 7, Long Island Iced Tea, a book that is doing too much. So the best example I can think of for that is Infinite Jest. This book just does too much. It tells the story in too much detail. It tries to work in too many things. Even though the footnotes are kind of interesting, it's not that original. And I think that kind of clouds what could have been a much better, shorter story. There are things in this there is some writing in this that I found to be quite beautiful, but David Foster Wallace just tried to do too much, and obviously struggled with that issue. Prompt number 8, Negroni, a book with a love triangle. I went with Persuasion, my favorite Jane Austen novel. Anne Elliot is involved in a love triangle with her cousin Mr. Elliot, who stands to inherit, I believe, a baronetcy if he marries Anne, and then Captain Wentworth. But also there's a love triangle between Anne Elliot and one of the Musgrave girls and Captain Wentworth, and then also a love triangle with Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth, and Captain Wentworth's best friend, I think his last name starts with a B. I want to say he's like Captain Benedict or something like that, but I might be thinking of Much Ado About Nothing. Anyway, that would be my book with love triangles. The next prompt 10 is, prompt 9 is Bay Breeze, a book with a light, chill, heartwarming vibes. I'm going to go with Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is just charming. Just a charming kind of story about a community, Cranford, which is really dominated by a lot of single or widowed women, and it appears that they are always, competing with one another in negative ways, but in reality they have one another's backs in really powerful ways. Prompt 10 is, Dark and Stormy, a book that's dark, thrilling, and menacing. I'm not sure this qualifies, but I thought of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel about Simon Bolivar's kind of last days, which is called The General in His Labyrinth. This is a story that takes place on a riverboat, essentially with South American liberator General Simón Bolívar taking a trip at the end of his life, and in part it's so people can pay homage to him, but he gets really involved in thinking about his own life and his own past and all the things he had to do to make things happen and all the regrets, and he's kind of tortured by this very interior book, and Marquez does a great job of setting the book in this kind of menacing, overly lush world on the outside, while we're deeply involved in, fictionally involved in Simón Bolívar's life, mental life on the inside. And the last prompt is Martini. Give a classic recommendation. I'm going to go with, because I'm still a champion of, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. Don't sleep on Anne Bronte. She is not the lesser Bronte's sister. And The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, while perhaps being a little bit too long in one section, is just a great book, really well written, and I always recommend it. So for this tag, I am going to tag, who am I tagging? Ooh. Oh, I'm going to tag Pei from the channel Attention. If you haven't checked out Pei's channel, the channel is called Attention, and I'm tagging him simply because I always enjoy his tags. He has a unique approach, sense of humor. Hopefully I'm not putting too much pressure on you there, Pei. But there you go. That's what I'm tagging. There we go. Roll Your Own Tag Tuesday is finally over. All 4 tags done. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.